Welcome to The Explainer. We're jumping right into a huge legal story that's unfolding as we speak. It's all about immigration, and the Supreme Court has just made a move that could have massive ripple effects, not just for a controversial law in Florida, but for the whole country. So here's the headline. The Supreme Court just shut down Florida's attempt to enforce its brand new immigration law. It was a quick, unsigned order, but the message was clear. For now, a lower court's decision to block the law, well, that block stays in place. The state's plan is on ice, at least for the moment. Okay, so what does this all really mean? To get the full picture, we've got to break it all down. What exactly is in this Florida law? Why did it end up in court in the first place? And what happens now that the Supreme Court has weighed in? All right, let's start with the law at the heart of all this. It's called Senate Bill 4C, and it was signed into law by Governor Ron DeSantis not too long ago. What this law tries to do, in a nutshell, is create a whole separate state-level system for enforcing immigration. And you have to understand, that is a huge deal. Why? Because for more than 100 years, immigration has been seen as something only the federal government handles. Period. And this is where things get really interesting. We're talking about a major power shift. SB 4C isn't just about copying federal law. No, it actually hands local police in Florida the power to arrest people for immigration violations. That's a job that has always belonged to federal agents. You can imagine, civil rights groups immediately sounded the alarm, worried about racial profiling. And it turns out, those weren't just fears. A U.S. citizen was actually arrested by mistake under this new rule right after it passed. So, as you can probably guess, this law was challenged in court almost the second it was signed. And that kicked off a really high-stakes legal battle that has been moving at lightning speed. So this all boils down to one fundamental disagreement. On one side, you have Florida saying, hey, our law is just here to help federal enforcement. It complements it. But on the other side, immigrant rights groups are saying, no way. They argue that if every state starts making its own immigration rules, you'd have total chaos. They believe this law is a direct challenge to the federal government's constitutional power over immigration. And if you look at how this is played out in the courts, there's a really clear pattern. The challengers have been winning, consistently, from the very first court that heard the case, all the way up to this latest move by the Supreme Court. Florida's law has been hitting a brick wall at every single stage. Okay, so here's a really crucial point. This whole fight, states versus the federal government on immigration, it's not new, not at all. In fact, there's a major legal precedent, a landmark case that the courts have been pointing to this whole time. And that precedent comes from a huge 2012 case called Arizona versus United States. Back then, the Supreme Court looked at a very similar law in Arizona and struck parts of it down. The court's message was crystal clear. The federal government's power over immigration is broad and undoubted. And honestly, that ruling has been the foundation, the bedrock, for pretty much every legal decision on this topic ever since. This all comes down to a legal idea called federal preemption. It sounds complicated, but it's pretty simple. It just means that when a state law and a federal law clash, the federal law wins. The Constitution basically gives the federal government the final say on immigration, and that's exactly what the 11th Circuit Court said here. They pointed out that the federal government has this massive, complex system for immigration, and Florida's law just steps all over it. So, where does this leave us right now? What are the immediate consequences of the Supreme Court's move? Let's get into it. The biggest takeaway for right now is, well, nothing changes. That block put in place by the lower court, it stays. That means Florida cannot start enforcing SB 4C. Local police can't start making arrests based on this specific state law. Everything is on hold while the case works its way through the legal system. And you know, it's really important to see that this isn't just about Florida. They're not alone in trying this. We've seen similar state-level immigration laws pop up in places like Texas, Oklahoma, Iowa, and Idaho. And what's happened every time? The federal courts have blocked them. The ACLU even calls it an unbroken string of defeats. It's a clear trend. The courts keep reinforcing that immigration is a federal job. So what happens from here? Well, even though this is a big loss for Florida, it's not technically the end of the road. Remember, this was just about an emergency request to the Supreme Court. The actual case, the full appeal, is still going to happen in the 11th Circuit Court. So for now, the law is just stuck in this kind of legal limbo, waiting for the next round. All of this really brings up a huge question, doesn't it? With court after court blocking these state laws, you might think the debate is settled. But the fact that so many states are still pushing these laws shows that this underlying tension between state power and federal power over immigration is nowhere near resolved. It's a fight that's going to keep playing out in the courts and in state capitals all across the nation.